This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you had a really nice lunch break. And I managed to get my computer to charge electricity again, which was nice because my battery was going down. So in this session, we will start with looking into the future because web accessibility, as we know, is a moving target. So one of the positive aspects of the way the EU has set up the legal framework around web accessibility is that the directives state who is going to be accessible, that is the sector, and what is going to be accessible. So in the case of the Web Accessibility Directive, these are the websites and apps, and with the European Accessibility Act, these are specific products and services. The how, which is technical specifications, those are stated in European standards. The EN standards, European norm, EN, are voluntary, but they are also used as presumed conformance to the accessibility directives, which means that these requirements are a way of not breaking the law. If you can come up with another way of making your interface accessible, you're free to choose that instead, but the standard is there to help. With this division between laws and standards, we can update the standards to meet technical developments, even though the law stays the same. And standardization is indeed slow, but legislation takes even more time. So this way, we have a chance for the accessibility requirements to better support the reality for end users. But the system is not perfect. For example, the minimum requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive are presented in Annex A of the EN 301549. Many requirements are indeed based on the WCAG 2.1 AA, but there are also specific EN requirements that are less known. There's very little support for testing the EN requirements if you use, for example, automatic tools, and the majority of the member states, when interviewed for the WAD review, claimed that the experts they hired to carry out monitoring and testing didn't have the experience or knowledge to know how to test for compliance of the complete Annex A. So the specific EN requirements come with far less supporting material, which is, of course, a challenge. But today, the European standardization organizations, ETSI, CEN, and CENELEC, are currently focusing on what lies ahead of us. So the updates of the EN 301549 on products and services, and the EN 17161 on design for all processes, and the 17210 on built environment, as well as the development of new standards on emergency services, documentation, support services, and to technical reports. All of those are needed to support the European Accessibility Act. So we are kind of looking to the future here. And to ensure that new laws are supported by relevant European standards, the European Commission issues something called standardization requests to the European standardization organizations. And we are currently in a process of finalizing the response to the standardization requests for the Accessibility Act, which is, to put it mildly, in due time. So at the same time as member states transpose the Accessibility Act to national legislation, the required standardization work hasn't even started. And 2025 is just around the corner, at least if you're producing complex products or services. So this is the background for today's standardization and requirements panel, where we will hear from standardization experts, industry, and the user perspective. So our distinguished panelists are Klaus-Peter Wegge, who is the head of Siemens Accessibility Competence Center, chair of the German Standardization Committee on Accessibility, and the German ICT Industry Association Bitkom working group on accessibility. He's also one of my colleagues in the so-called joint working group, which is the ETSI, CEN, and CENELEC joint technical body on e-accessibility, so responsible for the EN 301549. And then we have Loic Martinez Normand, who is the adjunct professor at the Computer Science School of the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid in Spain, and an expert in Spanish standardization committees on ICT accessibility, and also one of my old friends from the joint working group. From France, we have Aurélien Lévy, who is the managing director of Temesis, an accessibility expert company in France. So here in representing kind of the industry, the people who need to understand how to and kind of work with the standards that we create. So thank you for being here with us today to give us that perspective. And then we have also Peter Schwalstatz, who is the former treasurer of the Association of the Wellbeing of the Blind in Sweden. And I want to thank Peter especially for jumping in, because Alf Lindberg from the European Federation of Hard of Hearing had to cancel very recently. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. So for the panel questions, I would like to know, in your view, what are the most important additions or maybe changes or improvements needed when we enter into a new round of updates of the EN 301-549? So if Loic would like to answer, and I know you could present a long list of things, but, but try to take the highlights or the most important parts and pieces of this, just to see the perspective from your side.
Okay, so thank you, Susanna. Thank you for to the organizers for inviting me, and special thank you to the interpreters and captioners because of the hard work we're giving them with these time restrictions that we need to speak shortly. I will try to be brief. I mean, I see many changes or several changes coming because of this standardization request, and probably we will harmonize with WCAG 2.2, which is almost finished. We will update the real-time text section, and there's a work from Etsy that has provided very detailed suggestions for change on that sections. There's going probably to be some new content on service-oriented accessibility requirements, as the directive has, the European Accessibility Act has these services on electronic communication services, transport services, consumer banking services, e-commerce, and things like that. So probably there's going to be something there, and maybe some changes in the structure of the standard to be able to tackle that part of it. And of course, hopefully improvements in how the standards is written, and bit of more consistency in some of the sections when we, let's say, we're not able to come up with proper precondition text all across the standard. And also personally, that's something like more personal than officially expected. I also would like to have improvements in authoring tools. I mean, the section of authoring tools in software is extremely short, because back in 2014, there was no official updated standard from the WCAG, from the W3C on that. And I think we need to. I've heard people talking about the need of authoring tools, either speaking or in the questions or in the comments. And I agree with them. We need a strong improvement there. And that would be all. Thank you.
But that's enough, I think, for us to chew on. But would you just for the people who are not kind of living and sleeping and eating standards, just to say something about the RTT question, so the real-time text, so what that, because that is kind of an upcoming an issue that has been recurring. So would you like to just expand a little bit on that, just for?
Yeah, how can I make it short? Okay, right. So basically, the standard defined back in 2014 that all ICT providing person-to-person voice communication should also provide real-time text at the same time, with some details. There has been lots of actions back and forth, changing, updating those requirements related to real-time text. At the time in 2014, there were even some technical difficulties that shouldn't exist right now at this time. There was an update of these real-time text requirements in the current version of the standard. So when we started working on the WCAG directive, but now there's also an additional work made by telecommunication companies, organizations inside of Etsy, who have been providing, let's say, usability requirements for real-time text, and they have added a specific section in the technical specification to provide suggestions for change in our European ICT accessibility standards, so to improve the content of this section. So that my understanding is that the goal is that it becomes more precise and more ready to be implemented across the different countries. And let's say, it implies a technology layer that needs to support for real-time text. So protocols, communication systems, that they are there, they're not so, maybe someone is, I don't think they are so difficult to do, but they involve telecommunication operators, infrastructure companies, and that makes it quite complicated.
Yeah, and it is freaking industry out. so that's why it's kind of sensitive issue. But thank you. I think that was a very good explanation. We could go on for hours talking just about RTT, but we won't. I want to turn to Aurélien from an accessibility expert, auditor, or tester perspective. What would you like to see from the update of the EN? How could we make it possibly better or more, well, in some way improved? Yeah.
So, in my opinion, at the moment, what can be difficult for an accessibility auditor is that if you look at the standards, it looks like it's just a copy of WCAG. And in fact, we have the other section of the document, especially on the video part, for example. So it's kind of difficult to understand if I have a video in a website, for example, should I apply only the web section part, or the web section part plus the video section of the document? And in some cases, if there is some additional requirements that are not in WCAG, maybe at some point it will be difficult if you work with customers that are not in Europe but in the US, for example, because it means that at that time you will have to do specific things for Europe that you are not obligated to do. It's good if you do, but you are not obligated to do in other regions of the world. So I think the standards maybe need to be very careful on and to be clear on what is in addition to WCAG and when you have to use each section of the document. So maybe it's not in the standard itself, but you mentioned maybe an how to use documents. So maybe something on maybe an online tools to help people to know which part of the normative document they have to follow, depending on the situation. So, for example, it can be a questionnaire asking, are you doing a website? Yes, is the website, do the website have videos and real-time interaction? Because, for example, now you will see also a video chat on the website in some case. So, once again, do I have to follow the requirements dedicated to the real-time text description that we just discussed before?
Okay, so more kind of procedural or supporting documents, more rather than kind of adding new things from the request from the industry here, so represented by France at least. So if I turn to Peter and the end user perspective, what would you say are the most important additions or changes to the EN standard that you would like to see in the future?
The obvious answer to that is, of course, the issues of cognitive accessibility. So far, the standards have focused on overcoming physical impairments, but making sure that users understand how to interact with the interface. And the actual content should be the goal for the next version, especially as the European Accessibility Act covers services like e-commerce and banking, which are far from straightforward for the most consumers.
No, that's true. So it adds a little bit extra complexity when we move into the next generation of legislation, so to speak. So yes, cognitive is of course on everyone's list, I think, to add on to that. And then I was, so thank you. And I want to ask also Klaus-Peter Wegge, and you asked me to ask you to be the last one in this round because your list was so long that you didn't want to spend everyone's time. So if I can ask you to be brief on the most important things that hasn't already been mentioned. So from the German perspective, what is?
Yeah, hi Susan and everybody on the web. Luik made a lot of points which I will not repeat, so that's fine. The first I would like to mention is the good issue of the EN. The very, very good issue is this European norm is used in 3 different areas. It's used for public procurement, it's used for Web Accessibility Directive, and it will be used for the European Accessibility Act. That means we have one big document, no fragmentation in this document, and I think this is a very big benefit. On the other side, I think the document must be more easy to use. That means, for example, I think it's very annoying and boring, all this work with this self-scoping. That means each requirement starts with an if-else question. Is the ICT a website? We have clauses like clause 9, we have 35 times the word if the ICT is a website. Oh, we are in the clause of websites. The same issue is about differences to the WCAG. We don't have a copy of the WCAG requirements in clause 9, and we have in clause 10 and 11 adaptations of the WCAG requirements with a documentation which words are changed, what are changed for grammatical reason, I don't know. This does not belong to the main part of the document. The main part shall include the real requirements, and all this documentation where it comes from, don't care, it belongs to the annex somewhere. This is not relevant for the daily work. As you already said, it is not clear for everybody that the web accessibility requirements are extended by about 40 new requirements, which are not included in the WCAG. Nevertheless, you have to use both documents at the same time, and that's simply boring. Other topics are, for example, closed functionality. The aspects of closed functionality in contrast to open functionality is spread over several clauses in the document. And if you are dealing with a product which is only use closed functionality, you have to walk through the complete document and you are perhaps missing something. And then I have a personal vision. The personal vision would be an HTML version of the document, which has long-term fixed links. So if you can, when you are operating, or when you are providing a report, an assessment report, you can simply put the links to the document in the report, and that saves a lot of time, and everybody will be directed to the same information. That would be extremely helpful. Let me make things much more simpler, make it easier to use, even if we run into the danger that simplification may lead to a 99% solution and not a 110% solution. But it is very important to make the document easy to use, easy to handle. Yeah, and then finally, I'm missing a lot of issues in the field of physical access in the clause 8.2, where we have much more knowledge. And we have, of course, much more knowledge, which should be included somewhere in the document, which comes from the ISO level. Especially, I would like to point to ISO 20071-5, where it is dealing with accessibility settings, which should be accessible. So this is an add-on to the document, and I think it's very helpful. So sorry, even a long story, but maybe this completes a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. So I love you for being kind of the super standardization person and thinking that the EN is boring. So
yeah,
that's usually what we hear from people outside of standardization. But if we also find it boring, and we need to do something about that. But I don't want to defend or argue against anything of what anyone said. But I think there is an attempt, at least, to make the document a little bit less incomprehensible. I mean, in the last version or 2 versions ago, we added the Annex E, which is a little bit of a, human language add-on trying to explain what it is about. And I think many different stakeholders are aware that we have all of these kind of challenges in the document. But it's also important to note that this is also a complex kind of ecosystem because of the European standardization organizations. When we have all three big, the ETSI, Siemens and Senelec, then when they work together, that also causes a kind of a layer of complexity with different systems and ways of working and methodologies and things like that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to make things easier. And the HTML piece is, I'm absolutely with you there, but it's not really a quick fix this. So I think, but we're all on the same page and we really want to make sure that the next version of the EN is much easier to use. And I also want to highlight that Klaus-Peter and his team has made fantastic work in making some of the tables of the EN accessible to screen reader users. That is not yet part of the official document, but if you reach out to either the German standardization body or to me, then we will be happy to provide it to you. But with disclaimer, this is not the real document and so on, but it's possible to use for screen reader users. So that's really, it's kind of a quick fix. It's a band-aid thing, but it's really a very good effort, I think, from Klaus-Peter. So Aurélien, you talked about something like a how to meet document to support auditors or testers in how to use the standard. So how do you envision that? Something similar to what WCAG has, or do you see something else like videos or hand-holding guidance? What is your kind of dream world looking like if you could really get something that would really help you and your colleagues to understand the document?
So I think it depends on the targeted audience. I mean, if you are looking for targeting the auditor, I think that at some point, the question about, this is a question that has already been discussed in the past, and the Europe already worked on this in the past, is a question of harmonized methodology of testing, because you know that if every country have a different methodology to test the same thing, at the end the result can be different. So I think if you are, for example, a public institution and then you have to do a public tender or European public tender, then it will be difficult for people to respond if they don't know how they will be judged. So it's a really important thing, I suppose, to be able to harmonize the methodology, the way we test things. So I know that there is some work on the W3C also on the subject. So I don't know if the European standard can also reuse what is currently worked on the W3C side. But it is really, for me, I think the most important things for the auditor. But if you look at a more broad audience, I agree with you that maybe some more communication material, I would say, will be beneficial because it will be easier for people to understand what is behind all these technical criteria. So it's always something that when we see a customer, you always want to understand what is behind this technical documentation, because for otherwise it's just a standard and it's just something for the IT, I would say, and not something that matter for real users.
Okay, so that's a good bridge to the real users. So then, Peter, from the end user perspective, what would you say? Is it kind of, how do we make it more easy to use, or something like a how to meet? Would that kind of bridge the gap? Because I think at least that the end user organizations also struggle with understanding standards and probably find them boring as well. But would a how to meet document, something similar to that, support the implementation? And in that case, kind of who would develop that? Who's responsible is it to make that bridge? Peter, you are muted. So Malcolm, you're the host. Can you unmute Peter remotely, or how does that work?
No, it's better that so.
Yep, now I hear you.
Can
So,
you hear me?
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so no, coming from what Aurélien said about a how to meet document, so for how to better support the implementation of accessibility requirements, do you think that such a document that is kind of a guiding document to the standard, do you think that would be beneficial for the implementation of the standard?
That may well be needed, but if so, it should be based on users' experience to support complex technical specification. With even more technical details seems like digging deeper in the same hole. With more user involvement, I'm sure many of the disputes among experts can be solved.
Okay, so involving the users would kind of make sure that the technical expert would need to listen to the users, and thereby they need to kind of align their views on how to interpret the standard. That's an interesting thought, which I kind of like, but it's difficult to make legal requirements out of, I think, because usually the Commission would like something that is more black and white. But that's a really good good idea. So if we look at from the standardization standpoint, Klaus-Peter, do you think that we should, or we or somebody should create a how to meet, or what is whose responsible is that, and how can we make sure that the standard becomes more implementable?
I think such a document explaining the EN is much appreciated, but we have two different levels of users of that. That is, on one hand, the group of end users who want to know more about this, we'll say, or abstract functional requirements. And on the other hand, the technical users who don't want to know exactly what's behind it. They simply want to know how to do and how to test it. And I believe this is not the task or not the main task of a standardization group or a standardization body. This is, from my point of view, a task which can be simply and good applied by research, by universities, by the education and so on, because they have the people to test the requirements, the explanations for them. And I would like to make another remark. We should be very careful. The EN is about the functional requirements. We have to be careful to put not in technical issues, and the same is valid for explaining material. So we want to know what to do for example, make accessible documents, but we don't want to include how the technique behind, because the technique behind is depending on whatever, on the operating system, on the development system, on the load coding system, don't know what. So we are in our EN at a functional, we'll say, a more high level, and we should also keep in mind that there will be technical developments which are not covered by the EN yet. And in this case, we should go back to the clause 4 of the document, which means which is dealing with the user needs. And I think my very last sentence, we should also keep in mind that this is the European norm, but it is taken over by many, many other countries. That means the impact of our work is more or less worldwide. Many countries, from South Africa to states in South America, India, and so on, take over our document, and the explanations should be in a way that they can be used and understood also in other countries. I think this is very, very beneficial for users as well as for industry.
Yes, I agree, and no one is more happy than me that the EN is spreading throughout the world. I think that is really rewarding to all of us. So Loik, what do you think? How to meet? You are kind of with me on the pedagogical side of things. What do you?
Yep. We need it. I mean, clearly we need it.
The short answer, yeah.
I've been pushing for some part of it since many years ago with this type of decision tree that related to what Aurélien said, that you need a way to first know which parts of the EN apply to a given situation. So this is a website that contains this. I mean, the example he gave, a website which contains video, which parts of the EN do apply. I mean, in addition to section 9, which is Web Accessibility, WCAG, basically, the video player that is in those web pages has to meet chapter, is it 7 on video players? So it has to be able to display captions, turn them on and off, and things like that. So yes, there's a need for this type of support. So I was thinking that how to like several layers. I like very much what Klaus-Peter has said about helping people understand the standard on one side, and then for more technical people, these 3 layers of first knowing which parts of the EN apply, and then this additional layer that Aurélien also said, how could we test for the requirements, and more specifically the non-WCAG requirements, which are less known, less common. I mean, let's work on ways. But there's then the difficulty that Klaus-Peter has said. The requirements in the EN are technology agnostic. We say what has to happen. We cannot say how. And that's different from WCAG, because WCAG is only for web. So you have this HTML. I mean, you're expected to use specific technologies, web technologies, and so you can be much more precise on how to test because you do know the technology. But the requirements of the EN have to apply to web technologies, to mobile operating system, to desktop operating systems, to non-existing future ICT technology, and we cannot be so precise in the testing procedures. Yeah, who could develop that? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, as long as I agree with Klaus-Peter, then probably the standard organizations are not the best people to do that. They need to be strongly involved, because if ever there's such a how-to document, it has to be without disclaimers. It has to be a faithful presentation of the EN. And the only way of doing that is involving the ESOs. But of course, could be developed by people more into teaching, education, communication, and outreach, and other activities. And finally, for the testing, I think, I mean, it has been really interesting to see the different approaches from different monitoring organizations in different countries. I think it's basically a common work from them I mean, we could help, or many people could help, but for them to agree and, let's say, collaborate in creating this set of tests, sharing this information. How do they test for mobile applications, which are a bit more difficult to test for than websites? How do they test for the requirements in section 5, which are the generic requirements? How do they test for, or how are going to test for real-time text in the future? That could, to me, be a really nice goal for those monitoring organizations to agree on that.
Yep, that's not a small task, but but absolutely, no, it's I agree, and it should, yeah. So there are many stakeholders that should, in the perfect world, be involved in this, and there also, I think, it needs to be funding. So that's what we are struggling with. And just for the caption, is the ESO is the European Standardization Organizations. Just for everyone to grasp the abbreviations that we are throwing around here. So my last question, and I want to start this for Peter, for kind of really looking into the future now. How can we improve standards and the way they are being used if we look more than just the EN, but I mean standards in general? So how can they be more useful or possible to use and not boring, as Klaus-Peter says, and not difficult to read? So we are all kind of complaining about the standards, but how can we improve them? What would be the best way to make sure that standards are more more used and useful. Peter, you're unmuted, so you can speak. Yeah.
I thought you said Klaus-Peter. The requirement would definitely benefit from more end users among the experts creating the standards. The users would benefit from a somewhat easier language, maybe in combination with the short video clips or illustration to showcase the content.
So it's also kind of too text heavy, the whole thing. That's kind of what we hear from different places. So yeah, so that's also that's a good that's a good input. So more kind of pedagogical material, more easy to digest maybe, and less text heavy. So we really have problems already kind of agreeing on how to write the text. So if we are also going to make illustrations and videos, I think that will be a challenge, but definitely I agree with you. And the fact that end users needs to be more involved, I think that is really something that most people agree on. That's kind of a missing point in what we do in standards. So Aurélien, what would be your take from the industry perspective, how to improve standards or accessibility standards in general? Because now we are not only working with the EN 301549, but also 700 other standards in the new request. So how can we make them better?
Once again, I think it depends on the objectives. Adding video to a standard document, I'm not sure it's the good direction. I think it's additional materials that need to be provided, as the WCAG do for WCAG, for example, more than changing a standard document. Standard documents are not made for broad audience, I would say. I don't know if to make the standard itself better, I think the important question is are the people aware of the subject? The problem is not maybe on the standard itself, it's the fact that people are not knowing anything about the subject. So until people are correctly teach on the subject, they will not use the standard anyway, regardless if it's technical or not technical. The people need to be teach on the subject, and when they know the subject, they will deep dive on the technical side if they need. They need deep dive on the human interaction part or user experience part if it's their daily job. So it's more, for me, it's more a question of education and communication than changing the content of the standard itself.
Okay, so awareness raising is kind of one of the getting that standard out there and make sure that it's used by more people would be a way forward. So that's thank you. That's also extremely important, of course, and something that, well, I don't really know how to make sure more people use it, but it's true that it's not as known as it should be, and we have done several research projects around this, and it's still kind of not so positive results. So I agree with you. That is a big gap as well to fill. And Klaus-Peter, what do you think? Now, please don't give me a super long list again with improvements. But
no.
I know you can. But what?
Yeah.
Just a couple of highlights from your wish list. How can we make sure that the standards in general are more used and useful?
First of all, the series of standards for accessibility should not have any contradictions to each other. So a clear framework. That I think it would be very helpful to have timely translations of the documents. Not all people work in English language, especially the public authorities.
This is, the green room. So this is just
we have background noise, please, Rachel. You are
for your session. You're in the last session of the day.
Rachel.
So we just want to be able to.
I think.
Okay, no. I try 2 more points. The other issue is we are often struggling with a yes, no, false or true decision, and I think we need to get rid of this. We have to come over this because we have to think about the efficiency of accessibility. At the moment, we have some test methods which are very complicated and cover only a short, very small part of accessibility. We need more efficient methods to do the accessibility testing, and standards can contribute to that. Yeah, that's the short list.
Yes, that's very good short list. Thank you. And Loic, what's your take on improving standards and making them?
Okay, so who has said? I mean, as Aurélien has said, I mean, standards are what they are. There are technical documents with the requirements that have to be met. They're not novels. They're not reading books. They're not fun. I mean, they never should be. How could I explain? So we need something in addition to the standard to support. I mean, we've been talking about the how to meet. We need something, additional material for explanation at different levels, for testing, as Klaus-Peter has said. I mean, we need something in addition to the standard, but it's not modification of the standards. It's if we really want accessibility to happen, there needs to be more knowledge on accessibility, and it has to be easy to reach that knowledge. And could be this how to one thing I do like a lot about the how to meet document in web accessibility is that it is interactive. So you select some features that you're interested in or that are part of your specific website, and then you get the specifics for you and not for other websites. So this type of interaction is important. So you have this non-linear version of the standard you can navigate at your ease. And I think there's a need of, how could I say, harmonized way of teaching accessibility, and let's say digital accessibility. We've been doing, I've known your fantastic videos with Microsoft and Funka. I've done myself in Spain, teaching of the EN when we started in public procurement, and many other countries probably do have something, but there's something like an online teaching with the basics at different levels that could be shared and used by anyone interested. But finally, that's not modification of the standards. I mean, the standards are technical. Technical description of what has to happen, and they're not made for easy reading. They're made as a reference. It's like having an encyclopedia of the accessibility requirements. That's not something you expect to be reading from the beginning to the end.
So isn't that kind of up to the market to bridge the gap between the standard and the understanding? I mean, the kind of the ordinary people or whatever. Isn't that supposed to be happening?
Yeah, but I mean, how would I say? This standard is mandatory by harmonize. I mean, it's harmonized, so it's mandatory as a ways of declaring conformity with the Web Accessibility Directive. Policymakers wishing that everyone follows it are probably responsible for making sure that people know what to do. It's not the market, not the market alone.
And it's also the question of translation that we touched upon earlier. In some member states, it's really a problem. It's a formal legal problem that you're required to do something, but the document that's supposed to help you doing that is in a foreign language, and that is not. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but there are legal implications of that seems to be complicated. So there are different layers of complexity in understanding and using this, and and several things that can be done better. So that's kind of the short list. So we got several good ideas from the audience when it comes to involving UX designers and easy to read, and many different things to make sure that the standard becomes better or easier to understand or grasp for all of us. So let's move on to the Q&A. We have quite a few questions here. So the first one is, what needs to be done to align the European standards being discussed here with those from the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, which is the UN specialized agency on technology? Loic or Klaus-Peter, do you have anything?
As far as I know, there's no misalignment. I mean, my knowledge of ITU standards are more technically oriented on how communication devices work. They have some recommendations on accessibility, but I don't see a misalignment there. Maybe if Jerry could give some concrete example, we could deal with that. But I mean, in fact, when we were working on the example I already given of real-time test communication, we also took a look at what was existing in the real-time test communication standards from ITU. The trouble is at the time they were outdated, based on the physical line telephones. Right. I mean, it was the old text telephones standards, but I mean, there shouldn't be any compatibility issues with those technical standards and the more functional accessibility standard we're talking about today.
Maybe I can add a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think each of the European standardization organizations has a counterpart on the international level, and on this level there is already a certain alignment achieved, and I hope even guaranteed. On the other hand, I know that, for example, the ITU TV group is currently working on improvement of the EN to make some suggestions, because digital TV will be included in the next round of the EN, and they are proposing something for the joint working group. So we'll see what happens, but it's really important to have this international alignment, and to make it finally more complex, we also seek for the alignment with the US-American regulation on accessibility.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. I have a small IT company and all these requirements look like a legislative nightmare for me. Any tips about how small businesses can get a better understanding on how to apply them? So maybe Aurélien, do you want to take a stab on that? A small company? Seems like a one-man company or almost. I have a small IT company.
Yeah. Once again, I think that, for example, if you look at the web accessibility, at least, I agree that at the moment, the standard itself is also as is a copy of WCAG, or mostly a copy of WCAG. There is already some available documentation that are not included in the standard regarding WCAG. So it's just that for me, in French or in English, a lot of resources that are available to understand, to better understand, and make the criteria easier to implement also. So maybe it's not the job for the European Union to do that, but sometimes people need some help to find what is a good resources and what is not a good resources. So it maybe I don't know if it's the WCAG or the standardization body in Europe can also work on the subject of to define what is an up-to-date resources, I would say. So and also we know that in web accessibility there is also some automatic tools to help to start. It do not cover everything for sure, but it's a beginning. So there is a lot of web extension, for example, to test things. There is color contrast tools if you do design that are more and more integrated in different software for design. So you need to look for practical solution and not just look to the standard itself.
Okay, yeah, so true. But I think, again, it's maybe difficult to find these tools because just as the standards are not known, also for us who work with this every day, it's kind of easy to get them. But I think for many of our clients, at least, who are kind of new to the topic, it's really hard to know where to start and where to find all things and so on. So, but I agree with you. There are many also free of charge tools and support measures out there. So we have a good comment here connected to this from the audience. I wonder why we keep complaining about the complexity of standards in the field of accessibility. Developers read all sorts of complex standards and learn new technologies literally overnight. Are we dealing with certain biases of people looking for excuses, not wanting to deal with accessibility? That's a good question, I think.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, one really good example of this was what happened in the web many years ago with Flash content. No one made Flash mandatory. No one claimed that Flash was either easy or difficult to handle, but it was happening across all the web. And it happened because people either feel motivated, felt they could gain more money from using it, or things like that. Trouble with accessibility is like a human bias. We don't think accessibility is something relevant to us as human beings. And because we don't think it is relevant to us, we don't want to think about accessibility. We don't want to see people with disabilities. We don't want to think that we could become a person with disability in the future. We are only, I mean, this type of saying that standards are complicated, it is because it's mandatory. We don't want to be accessible. We just have to be accessible. And that's, to my personal opinion, to that. I mean, yeah, it was a really good question.
Yeah, so it was a good statement, I think so. And I also think I agree with you, Loic, but also accessibility is kind of not sexy enough. That I think that is our problem, some ways. So we have another comment here: helping people, especially developers, understand that the real life implication for end users of not implementing particular standards could also be perhaps useful for people to kind of get going with this or understanding. So I think that was in connection to how to make them more useful or understandable. And I think that's a good point, which, well, I kind of like the EN 301-549. I think that the Annex B, the super complex table there, can actually be used exactly for this. But of course, you need to know how to do it, and it's still a boring table. So, but I agree. For making sure people understand what happens if we don't do anything, that can be really a driver for kind of waking people up for doing accessibility work. I absolutely agree on that. Another comment is that if we say we expect people to be included in the digital and physical world, but wouldn't we also expect the standards to follow the basic guidelines of accessibility? Otherwise, some people with disabilities and many others can't use them. So yes, that is absolutely true. And not only are they difficult to read, but in some cases also not accessible to all user groups. So and I can just say that we are trying in the joint technical body, the joint working group, to make sure that the standards and the processes and the meetings and everything we do are becoming increasingly accessible. That is kind of I shouldn't say it's a new job, because it's not, but we are focusing more on it from this. We're kind of restarting the work, and we are really trying to make sure that whatever we can do to make things more accessible in the standardization procedures and so on, we are really trying. And I feel the whole group is really committed to doing this. So hopefully there will be at least a small improvement in the years to come. I really hope that. So it's probably out of scope of standardization bodies, but what work has been or will be done to include the standard and more accessibility in various educational curricula in the EU universities and courses? So we will touch on that in the next panel when we talk about research, because some of the projects there have to do with exactly that. So I'll save that question for that. And there's another one more or less the same, looking at the future with, is there engineering curriculum at the university to teach building accessibility and so on. So people are already kind of moving ahead to the next panel. That's good. And I saw something from in the chat as well. It's difficult to read in two places. So standards should be followed up by easy language, illustrated guidelines. Standards must follow specific rules for how they are organized, but user participation should be facilitated by making it free for these representatives. So yeah, this comment comes from Norway, where actually the participation is free of charge. So I agree, it should be not only lowering the accessibility thresholds, but also, of course, the economic thresholds of involving users in the standards work.
Susanna, we missed one answer. Sorry for interrupting you.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, please.
I think there was a little bit of pain for the very small companies, and I think we should give some more advice on that, because I know it's very hard for a one or two man's company to jump into accessibility, but there are solutions available. For example, in Germany, we are creating a center for advising small companies because small and medium-sized companies play a certain role in the European Accessibility Act, and they need some help. And at least in Germany, I probably expect the same developments in other countries. There shall be a group or organization who helps them to start. On the other hand, there are people available on the market who can explain you what to do in your certain situation. That please simply invest one day of consultants, and you will save a lot of money and time when doing it on yourself. I think this sounds a little bit crazy, but indeed, I made really the experience that people wasted so much time for issues they are not relevant. And the final recommendation is you are using for your work certain software. Have a look at the documentations of the vendors of the software, and they should have accessibility guidance available. Or if not, ask them. So don't try it on your own.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. Thank you, Klaus-Peter. So, I like that. And really that is what IAAP is all about, by the way, that kind of networking and building communities so that our members do share knowledge and ask each other and get support on all sorts of issues. And there are, of course, other networks and communities as well. But I think that is really important, that even if not everyone knows about accessibility, we are enough people to support each other and help you out. So do reach out and don't try it on your own. That's a good recommendation. That's very nice. So,
Susanna?
Yeah,
please. I have something to add. Like the European Accessibility Act says that micro enterprises, which are small businesses with fewer than 10 employees, are exempt from making their websites accessible. So the entrepreneur who said, well, where to start, I think he is under that. He falls under that category.
Well, it depends on if it's products or services.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Then that didn't come through for the question. I don't know if they are producing products or services, so there are differences in the legal act is included and not, but that's a good point. So not everyone is in scope of the Accessibility Act. So another question is there already, or is there planned, a guideline for public sector body developers in order to define the requirements a software developed in public sector body has to meet, so WCAG compliance is secured from the start, and to minimize the accessibility failures from the beginning? So kind of by default built-in accessibility, if I understand this correctly. Do you want to speak to that, Loic? Some kind of born accessible attitude for this?
I mean, that was part of my reasoning when I talked about the need to have more authoring tool. And when I'm thinking about authoring tools, I'm not only thinking about web development tools, but I mean, software development tools in general should help support people to make accessible user interfaces, which means that they will meet the standard. So if everything was properly prepared and you use the standard tools to develop in a specific operating system, that tool should help and support you creating accessible content. In fact, it should create something accessible by default, unless the developers start messing with it. It's not happening, but in fact, but it is somehow happening if you develop for mobile operating systems, the two existing today. And if you really use their guidelines and their official tools and you do nothing special, the user interface has lots of possibilities of being accessible. Trouble is when you start moving out from that. And the same happens in desktop environments. Again, the standard tools from the major vendors of the operating systems, again, do support lots of accessibility features. If you just don't create new ways of interaction. And when you need to create them, then is when you need to get full into the how to meet accessibility, and then right, you do the work as a developer. Yeah. And the old example of Flash that I use, I mean, if you're really interested in that new way of interaction, then you do the work and you learn the standard and you implement it. But if you're doing basic standardized user interfaces or interactions, you should not need to do anything special.
It's true. This is a good point. And also, so stay put, but also if you, I would like to add that if you add something really new, flashy, or something you haven't tried before, or you kind of want to build something that is upside down, that's absolutely fine. But then you need to do user testing, because if it's very, very new, then maybe the standard doesn't cover it yet. So Peter, you're raising your hand, please. But you're on mute.
Unmute. Okay, sorry, I have to go.
Okay, so we are, no? Yes, we are just wrapping up. So did you have a final comment, or?
Okay. No, thanks. It's very interesting, but I have to leave.
Okay, that is absolutely fine. Thank you for joining us today. And it's now precisely 2:15. So I will thank the panelists and thank you everyone for your questions. I do see the question about IAAP certification that I will let Christopher respond to when we have the IAAP session later today. So thank you everyone for this good interaction, and please do grab a cup of coffee and stretch your legs or do something else for 15 minutes so that you come back fresh and we can talk about research and innovation after the coffee break. Thank you everyone.
Thanks, Susanna, for leading this session.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.